The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today is day 5 of this 7-day sesshin here at Mountain Gate in northern New Mexico during the rainy season, although it hasn't rained until just a few minutes ago, which is pretty tremendous. And you can hear perhaps the thunder in the background, and you may even have heard it a few minutes before this. Who knows? I understand that there are problems with Zoom all over the world, and particularly in the East Coast, and that the Zoom folks have figured out what the problem is and are working on remedying it. That plus the storm may create a situation where we lose connection. So you know what to do. Keep going. Yesterday, I introduced you to Chinul, or perhaps in some cases reintroduced you. Chinul, the 12th, well, he was born in the 12th century and died just early into the 13th century in Korea. And he's one of the 2 foremost, after all those decades, after all those centuries, really. Son, which is the Korean Zen teachers. He was, as you heard yesterday, born into a family, a reasonably wealthy family. His father had a professional position. I don't remember exactly what it was. And he was a pretty sickly little kid, to the point where they weren't sure whether he would survive. And his father did everything possible to try to get him the best medical care, but it wasn't succeeding. And so finally his father vowed that if the child survived, that he would ordain him as a monk. And so when he was 8, apparently all his afflictions disappeared. And so his father had his head shaved. Now, as a child, I don't know what the conditions back then in Korea were, but in Japan nowadays, little boys are ordained sometimes at the age of 4 or 5 years old. And in fact, in the photograph of Mitra-roshi's installation as an abbot at Sogenji, there is his nephew seated at his feet at the age of 5 in Buddhist monk robes. And his nephew is now getting close to 40 years old at this point and is a resident monk at Sogenji. Not all children who are ordained as children grow up to become monks, professional monks, or enter monasteries. It's not clear exactly what the whole thing is about, other than in Japan, because so many of the temples are family temples. They're trying to keep a family lineage going, and so they ordain their sons. And as a matter of fact, in Mitra-roshi's own life, he was born and raised in a Zen Buddhist temple in Nara, Japan, and he had an older brother and several younger sisters and one older sister. And his older brother, on the death of their father, was tasked with taking over the family temple. He was not a happy camper in that direction. He had been I think probably what they call a salaryman in Japan, somebody who worked in a business. But when his father died, in order to maintain the family temple, somebody had to be the priest. And so he got the job as the eldest son, which meant that his younger brother, Harada, younger brother, Harada was their last name, was exempt, at least for that time. And in fact, Harada Shodo-roshi had no interest whatsoever in becoming a professional monk, having been raised in a temple which was not a teaching temple. In fact, the background story is that his father had actually gone into some training at Shofukuji Monastery because he had seen in his own fortune, he had been a fortune teller for a little while, and he when he was married to Harada Shodo-roshi's mother, and before they had any children, she had a dream in which he was dressed in monk's robes, and the name on the takohatsu bag was Shofukuji, and so he took it as a sign that he should become a monk, and so off he went and became a monk, but a professional monk, not a teaching monk. He was in the Osho-san category. I think it might be called that. Osho is the title for the head of a temple, and it does not have anything to do with whether the person has any sanctioning to teach or not. It's simply a temple head. And so he did the 2 to 3 year training that would teach him how to do some basic zazen, how to do some ceremonies, and essentially run a temple and offer funeral services and ceremonial services to the people that joined the temple. And that was Harada-roshi's experience of a Buddhist temple until he encountered one day as a teenager Yamada Mitra-roshi and discovered that there was something deeper. Harada-roshi had majored in psychology in university because he didn't like himself. And he thought that through psychology, he could change these characteristics of his personality and become a better person. And then he met Mitra-roshi and discovered that there's a deeper, more effective way to do that. And it is through zazen. And so he abandoned, he did graduate from college, but as soon as he was done, he walked to Kobe, to Shofukuji Monastery, and became a student of Yamada Mitra-roshi. And ever since, he has demonstrated and brought his students, many students all over the world, to awakening, through which, the process through which we can grow, change, open to our innate compassion and wisdom, and allow it to function so much more freely than it can within a constrained self-image. And that is what Buddhism teaches us is possible, because fundamentally, as Chinul believed as well, and as any serious Zen teacher can tell you, that all beings are endowed with this innate perfection. And this is how it's been put with regard to Chinul. He feels that nirvana is a sublime essence present in all beings. Nirvana, a sublime essence present in all beings. That means you. That means everyone. No matter what their behavior is, no matter what their history is, it is inborn, it is innate, and it can be uncovered increasingly. And it's warmed my heart to see how people in this sesshin are uncovering that. There is no need to search elsewhere, as since time immemorial, it has been innate in everyone. What is there we lack outside us? The true nature of all people is unchanging, and their minds are ultimately numinous, aware, and never dark. Numinous, aware, and never dark. Even though anyone who has had depression knows darkness, but the innate nature of our minds is numinous, aware, and not dark. It remains on us to have the faith that we can uncover this numinous awareness that we are. So Chinul had his head shaved at age 8, but he didn't actually leave home and join a monastery until he was 15. And at the time, as you heard yesterday, Korea was filled with strife. Filled with strife and filled with all kinds of attempts to gain riches, prestige, power. It's not so different from our current time, actually. And yet out of that came Chinul. He was discouraged by the fact that the Buddhist clergy had deteriorated as well into people who entered the monastery through examination, by the way, which he passed at 24, and that was something. It was considered a gateway to potential government service, which is kind of funny, given that monastic life would be not exactly something where you would enter in order to go into government service and gain power and prestige. It's a little bit counter to the whole point in doing Buddhist practice, which is to uncover that innate, numinous, aware beingness that we are. So he left, and he was determined to form an association, which he and a number of fellow monks felt would be really important, and it would be focused on samadhi, zazen, deep opening to our innate essence, and prajna, the rising up of our innate wisdom, transcendental wisdom, not street smarts exactly, and not the kind of sharp mind you get to climb over people in an institution or a corporation. This is not teaching you how to, quote, survive in the corporate jungle or flourish in the corporate jungle. It's about something more important, far more important. If your karma has brought you to work in industry, there's no problem with that. But it's going to be challenging because in most industry in the world, there is an emphasis on getting to the top, even at the expense of climbing over other people and playing dirty with them. That's not what life is about. That's not what Buddhism is about. That's not what awakening is going to show us is even useful or valid. So he and his fellow monks, I think there were maybe, how many of them? I don't remember, in the initial group that vowed to get together at a future time and form this Samadhi and Prajna association, where their focus would be on practice, deepening practice, rather than trying to climb the ecclesiastical or government ladders. And so time went by. In the meantime, he worked on himself and had at least one Kensho, and I believe a second Kensho as well. And then finally, the time came when those that remained of the monks that were initially interested in developing this society gathered. Some of them had died. Some of them had decided they would rather rise in the ranks of the monastery and the government. But some of them were still committed to deep practice. And again, this is not to disparage corporate work. If it's our karma to do corporate work, to do it in an enlightened way, in a way that does not deny compassion, that remains aware and generous and compassionate. In this way, it's its own type of practice. And of course, we do the Zazen regularly so that we can discern naturally how to move in compassionate and wise ways without having to think about it. As we go deeper in our practice, that clarity that comes forth allows us to see how to move forward in the most appropriate way. And it's, as I said, it's not a calculating thing. So finally, they came upon creating this Samadhi and Prajna association. And Chinul, at the time, Korea was sort of divided into two Buddhist camps. Those invested in the sutras as a way of practice, and those invested in Zazen as a way of practice. And he felt that there really wasn't a dichotomy between them, that they could blend, they could be integrated into everyone's practice, despite the fact that they appeared to be, and people felt that they were two different paths. And he took to studying the sutras. He had his awakening, his first awakening, out of 3, by the way. He had his first awakening through Zazen, and he checked it out and studied to see if it accorded with what is taught in the sutras, and found that it did. And so that is what convinced him that both sutra teaching and sutra practice combined with the Zazen was especially effective. And he had more awakenings, as you already have heard. Let's see if we can share some of his. Sure, I got the right glasses on here. So with regard to the third awakening, and this time he had just come from Sangmu-jam. More than 10 years had passed since I came from Pomun-sa. Although I was satisfied that I had cultivated diligently and had not wasted my time, I had still not forsaken passions and views. In other words, I was still caught in this self-image and the tyranny that it caused. It was as if something were blocking my chest, or as if I were dwelling together with an enemy. While sojourning on Mount Chiri, I obtained the records of Son Master Dahui Pujue. Now, Dahui is Dai Zenji, whose vow for awakening we chant every evening at the end of the sitting. I obtained the records of Son Master Dahui Pujue, which said, Son does not consist in quietude. In other words, Zen does not consist in quietude. It does not consist in bustle. It does not consist in the activities of daily life. It does not consist in ratiocination, the process of thinking. Nevertheless, it is of first importance not to investigate Son while rejecting quietude or bustle, the activities of daily life or thinking. Unexpectedly, your eyes will open, and you then will know that these are all things taking place inside your own home, meaning your profound, fundamental home. I understand this passage, and naturally nothing blocked my chest again. And I never again dwelt together with an enemy. From then on, I was at peace. From then on, I was at peace. As you've heard before, we're born, we grow into our culture, our subculture, through example, through interaction with our caregivers, through what we're taught in school. And as part of that, we develop a sense of how to function in that subculture. But we also develop ideas about whether we are successful or not, whether we're not doing well enough, whether somebody else in the family, for example, is more revered than we are, whether we are disdained even by our family and our friends, where we feel valued by society or not. And we desperately work to be whatever it seems to be that is essential in order to belong. And sometimes there are strange things that we do in order to belong. And what is it? This Latin American violent group of young men that requires, as an initiation, one has to actually murder somebody. Thankfully, most of us have not grown into that type of culture. But nonetheless, we still have our ideas of what we think we need to be in order to be accepted, in order to be loved, in order to be honored. And that creates a great big hole in our being when we feel we're not. And so we often search outside of ourselves to fill that hole. We try to twist ourselves into some format that will be acceptable, even though perhaps our own inclinations are very different and equally honorable, but not honored by our birth family, for example, or the people that we hang with. And that creates a great deal of suffering in our life. and it's artificial. Every human being born is endowed with this innate perfection. And they may have the good karma of being born into a family that honors that. But even then, sometimes we get a swelled head about things. I've seen this happen even with toddlers, when the parents are overly excited about this kid and in essence turn the child into a performing toddler for the edification of them and their friends. And then that child grows up and continues the same kind of behavior that was cute when they were 2, but is quite dysfunctional when they are 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years old. So who are we really? The irony is that we can function beautifully in society if we are able to tune in to whatever is blocking our ability to inhabit freely who we are, not the image of who we think we ought to be, but who we really are. Take the risk. It's a challenge. It's a very big challenge. But for people who have had a deep enough awakening experience, it's very clear that it's not necessary for survival. It's not necessary for happiness. It's not necessary for joy. It's not necessary for ethical, compassionate functioning to maintain that artificial self-image. Yet, it's not that easy to allow ourselves to see through it. We don't have to get rid of it. All we have to do is see it for what it is. And to let go our life grip, or death grip, I guess they call it, on it. As we grow into a culture, we naturally begin to understand how to behave in the culture, but there is that overlay of conditioning that affects and brings forth a particular type of self-image where we feel less than, or something's missing. What is it? What is it? Like Chinul's feeling that he was, and this is after 2 Kensho experiences, by the way, that he was dwelling with an enemy, that he had this tightness in his chest. We can be free of that tightness in our chest. Millennia has gone by, more than 2 millennia have gone by, where people, countless human beings just like us, have become free of the tyranny of the self-image. And they didn't go babbling down the middle of the street naked. They were functioning members of society, profoundly functioning members of society who were living a compassionate and wise life. Each one of you has made inroads into seeing where you're caught. And that's so vital in terms of becoming free of those caught places. So here on day 5 of Sesshin, you've already done a great deal of very, very important work. And you have moved deeper. That's very clear. So the important thing is to take advantage of that and to continue that work, to reach the point of letting go-ness that you've reached thus far in sesshin, whether you realize that you have let go or not. You have. There's been a quantifiable difference that I've been able to see in each one of you. And you can continue to deepen that, whether or not you recognize it or not. You just keep going in the same direction that you're going in now. Mitra-roshi used to say that to get to the depth that you've gotten in on day 5, you'd have to go through 5 days of sesshin if you stop now and try to re-up it later. One of the wonderful things about training at Sogenji when I was doing it there is there were, in the fall and the winter, I guess it's fall technically, November, December, there were 3 7-day, actually 2 7-day, 1 8-day sesshin. There was the November Ozashin of 7 days, and just a few days later, 3-4 days later, no more than that, there was Rohatsu. And then after Rohatsu, only 3 or 4 days later, sometimes just 2 or 3, there was another 7-day sesshin. When I first heard about it, I thought, holy tamale, this is going to be intense. But it turns out it's amazing because you never fall back to square one at the end of a sesshin before you begin the next one. And so the next one builds very quickly on where you had just left off in the last one. And then there's a third one. It's amazingly potent. And when I first came back from my training there and wanted to do something like that at Mountain Gate, and it got kind of tangled up in the American cultural calendar because we've got Thanksgiving at the end of November, and then we have Christmas coming up. And it was very difficult to set up 3, even 7-day sesshin at that time. But that is still something I would love to do at some point, at least 2 in a row, because as daunting as it sounds, it is amazingly productive and effective. So actually, since we're in COVID shutdown, perhaps it would be possible at some point, independent of Thanksgiving and Christmas, perhaps in the new year, we could do a couple of one after the other sesshin, and each of you could go so much deeper that way. It's phenomenal. Already I've talked enough, and the important thing, of course, is to recognize at some level that you are worthy and that you can open to the most splendid beingness that you are, because it's there. It's only covered up by our ideas of who we think we are, who we think we ought to be. And that's not who we are. Who we are is wondrous. Who we are, numinous, aware, never dark. Open to that increasingly fully and find that river of joy that runs through life and allows one to live fully that wisdom and compassion that is innate in each of us. Thank you for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.